The city knew Jay as the Iron King, a man who had successfully turned his heart into a fortress of ice. For a decade, his word was a death sentence and his presence meant the end of an empire. He believed that mercy was a slow-acting poison, until a 6-year-old girl walked into the middle of a massacre. Tonight was supposed to be a final audit, a rain-slicked execution in a dark alleyway. But as Jay raised his weapon, he froze. Standing in the crossfire was Mirabelle, clutching a tattered teddy bear and staring at him with eyes that held a terrifyingly familiar light. They were the exact same eyes as the sister he had lost to these very streets 20 years ago. As police sirens wailed in the distance, Mirabelle didn't run from the man with the blood-stained sleeve. She reached out, her small hand locking onto his, and whispered, "Are you lost too?" Jay didn't return to his penthouse that night. Driven by a compulsion that defied his cold logic, he followed her into the deepest shadows of the slums. He peered through the window of a crumbling apartment, expecting a rival's trap, but what he saw inside threatened to melt the very foundation of his kingdom. The Iron King was about to realize that his greatest enemy wasn't a rival boss. It was the truth hiding in a child's broken home. The transition from the rain-slicked luxury of his armored sedan to the decaying heart of the slums felt like stepping into a cold grave. Jay stood in a hallway where the walls wept with dampness and the air was thick with the suffocating scent of boiled cabbage and unwashed desperation. His $5,000 charcoal suit, hand-stitched and pristine, felt like an insult to the surroundings, a shimmering coat of armor worn by the very man who had engineered this ruin. He moved like a shadow, his polished Oxfords making no sound on the warped floorboards as he followed Mirabelle. The girl stopped at a door that hung crookedly on its hinges, the wood scarred by forced entries and neglect. She didn't knock, she simply slipped inside, her tattered teddy bear tucked tightly under one arm. Jay leaned against the shadow of the doorframe, his breath hitching as he peered through the jagged crack in the wood. The room inside was a hollow shell of a home, lit only by the flickering blue light of a dying television. But it wasn't the poverty that froze Jay's blood, it was the transaction happening at the kitchen table. There sat Marco, his most trusted lieutenant, the man who sat at Jay's right hand during every strategy meeting. Marco wasn't there to offer aid. He was weighing out glass-and baggies of white powder stamped with the Iron King's seal, Jay's own signature of power. Jay watched as a skeletal woman, eyes hollowed by the very poison he distributed, traded a handful of crumpled bills for a moment of chemical peace. Mirabelle stood just feet away, oblivious to the deal, trying to flatten the matted fur of her bear. The realization hit Jay with the force of a physical blow. The Iron King wasn't a title of honor, it was a brand of destruction. The fortress of ice he had built around his heart began to crack, not from the cold outside, but from the rot he had planted within. Every dollar that funded his penthouse, every stitch in his expensive suit, was paid for by the light fading from this child's world. Marco laughed at something the woman said, a sound of casual cruelty that echoed in the cramped space. Jay's fist clenched until his knuckles turned white. He had spent 10 years believing he was an apex predator, but looking through that crack in the door he finally saw the truth. He wasn't ruling a kingdom. He was presiding over a slaughterhouse, and the first victim was the little girl who thought he was just another lost soul in the rain. The transformation of the tenement began not with a grand gesture, but with the silent, terrifying efficiency of a shadow empire turned toward creation. Jay sat in the back of his darkened sedan, watching through polarized glass as a crew of men who usually spent their nights disposing of bodies, replaced the rusted, broken plumbing of Mirabelle's floor. They moved with a frantic urgency, driven by the knowledge that the Iron King was watching from the curb, his gaze colder than any winter. Within a week, the hallway no longer smelled of rot. The local thugs, predators who had once circled the building looking for easy prey, had vanished. They hadn't been arrested. They had simply been repositioned by Jay's enforcers with a message so brutal they didn't stop running until they hit the city limits. Every morning, a nondescript delivery van arrived, stocking the woman's pantry with fresh produce and medicine that cost more than the apartment's yearly rent. Mirabelle was a ghost in her own home, protected by a guardian she didn't know, breathing air that was finally clean. But while the slums grew quiet, the war room at the heart of the syndicate began to boil. For the first time in a decade, the seat at the head of the mahogany table remained empty during the Friday summit. Jay was absent, his phone diverted, his focus redirected to a flickering security feed of a little girl playing with a tattered bear in a safe room. "The boss is losing his edge," Marco whispered, his voice a low snake hiss that carried through the room of armed men. He leaned back, his eyes darting toward the empty throne. He's skipping sit-downs to wander the streets like a common vagrant. He's forgotten that we don't rule by charity, we rule by fear. The air in the room grew thick with the scent of impending mutiny. In the underworld, a leader who isn't seen is a leader who is no longer feared. The syndicate was a machine built for war, and it didn't understand the sudden, quiet pivot toward protection. They saw Jay's silence as a crack in the armor, a sign that the Iron King had finally rusted. As Marco's hand moved toward his concealed holster, the silent consensus was reached. If the king was too soft to hold the crown, someone else would have to take it. Jay was playing bodyguard to an innocent, unaware that the very men he had trained were now sharpening their knives for his back. The predator's instinct that had kept Marco at Jay's right hand for a decade was the same one that eventually led him to the truth. While Jay was busy playing God in the shadows of the slums, Marco was playing detective. He didn't find a hidden stash of cash or a secret alliance with a rival family. Instead, he found a grainy photograph of the Iron King sitting in a parked sedan, his eyes fixed on a child playing hopscotch. Marco stared at the image in the dim light of his private office, a slow, serrated smile spreading across his face. He had expected a tactical blunder or a hidden mistress, but this was far more valuable. This was a soul. He realized that the little girl wasn't just a distraction. She was the single point of failure in Jay's otherwise impenetrable armor. To Marco, Mirabelle wasn't a child. She was the perfect lever, a small, fragile tool capable of prying the entire empire from Jay's cold grip. The kidnapping was executed with the same terrifying efficiency Jay had taught him. There was no struggle, no dramatic scream. Only a tattered teddy bear left abandoned on the freshly paved sidewalk where a black van had momentarily idled. By the time Jay's security feed flickered to show an empty street, the Iron King's world had already been halved. The phone rang in Jay's penthouse, the vibration rattling the glass of expensive scotch on the table. He didn't need to check the caller ID. The building is safe, the pipes are fixed, and the pantry is full, Marco's voice hummed through the line, dripping with a poisonous irony. But I think you've forgotten the most important rule of the trade, Jay. Never get attached to the inventory. The stakes of the war had shifted in an instant. This was no longer about territory, drug routes, or offshore accounts. The mahogany table and the throne in the war room were suddenly nothing more than piles of firewood. Marco made the terms clear. The digital keys to every vault, the signed deeds to the shell companies, and the total abdication of the throne, all in exchange for one small life. Jay stood by the window, looking out over the city he had conquered, realizing that every building he owned was a prison cell. He had spent his life believing that a throne was the ultimate prize, but as he looked at the empty space on his desk where the bear should have been, he knew the truth. The empire was a shadow. The child was the light. Marco thought he was forcing a king to surrender his crown, but he didn't realize that Jay was finally ready to burn the whole kingdom down just to keep that light from going out. The warehouse at the edge of the docks was a cathedral of rusted iron and salt-stained concrete, a place where the city's secrets went to be buried. Jay stepped through the heavy sliding doors, his footsteps echoing against the hollow space with a finality that silenced the hum of the idling black vans. He didn't come with the thunder of an invading army or the screech of tires. He came alone. Marco stood on a raised industrial catwalk, flanked by a sea of men with fingers tensed against triggers. 100 barrels were aimed at Jay's chest, 100 small circles of death waiting for a signal. In the center of the floor, sitting on a wooden crate, was Mirabelle. She was too small for the vastness of the room, her eyes wide and wet, her hand clutching the air where her bear should have been. When she saw Jay, she didn't see the Iron King, or the architect of a bloody legacy. She saw the man from the rain. "Where is your iron, Jay?" Marco shouted, his voice bouncing off the corrugated metal walls. "Where is the king, who taught us that mercy is a poison? You're standing there naked." Jay didn't reach for a concealed weapon. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal jacket and pulled out a slim black leather folio, the master keys to every offshore account, every shell company, and every encrypted server that held the syndicate together. With a slow, deliberate motion, he tossed the folio onto the oil-stained floor. It slid through the grit, stopping at the base of the catwalk. "The empire is yours, Marco," Jay said, his voice low and resonant, carrying a weight that a chrome pistol never could. "Every route, every cent, every drop of blood I've spilled to build it, is all in that folder. Take the crown. It's as heavy and hollow as you deserve." Marco laughed, but the sound was brittle, lacking the triumph he had expected. He looked at the man below, unarmed, vulnerable, and completely unafraid, and realized he had lost. Jay wasn't surrendering, he was ascending. By choosing the life of a single child over the throne of a kingdom, Jay had destroyed the only leverage Marco had. The Iron King was dead, and in his place stood a man who had finally realized that the greatest power wasn't the ability to take a life, but the courage to offer his own. "Let her go," Jay commanded, and for the first time in 10 years he wasn't speaking as a boss but as a protector. He watched as the men with the guns looked at each other, their loyalty flickering like dying embers. He had just burned the entire empire to the ground, and as the smoke of his legacy cleared, the only thing left standing was the small girl reaching out for his hand. The sirens had long since faded, and the smoke from the burning ledgers had vanished into the gray morning sky. The syndicate did not collapse with a roar. It dissolved into ash the moment Jay walked out of that warehouse with Mirabelle's hand in his. Without the Iron King to hold the fractured pieces together, the empire simply ceased to exist. The vaults were emptied by the greedy, the traitors like Marco were consumed by the very chaos they had courted, and the name Jay had spent a decade building was whispered only as a cautionary tale in the shadows. Jay stood at the edge of a bustling sidewalk, the morning sun warming the back of his neck. He wasn't wearing a $5,000 suit or a watch that cost a common man's yearly salary. He wore a simple cotton jacket and jeans, his face just another anonymous mask in a sea of commuters. For the first time in 10 years, no one bowed as he passed, and no one reached for a weapon in his presence. He was a nobody, a ghost of a king who had traded his throne for the quiet weight of a child's backpack slung over his shoulder. Beside him, Mirabelle skipped, her tattered teddy bear, now carefully mended with clumsy, oversized stitches, peeking out of her bag. She didn't look back at the slums or the darkness of the warehouse. She only looked toward the bright yellow doors of the primary school at the end of the block. "Are you coming to pick me up later?" she asked, stopping at the gate and looking up at him with those familiar, clear eyes. Jay knelt, ignoring the dust on the pavement, and straightened the collar of her shirt. He felt the phantom weight of the Iron King crown fall away completely, replaced by a peace so profound it felt like a physical warmth. The empire he had built on blood and fear was gone, and in its place was a singular, sacred duty. He had lost the world, but he had found himself in the eyes of the one person who didn't care about his power. "I'll be right here," he promised, his voice steady and free of the coldness that once defined it. He watched her run toward the doors, a small splash of color joining the crowd of children. Jay stood among the parents and the strangers, a man with empty pockets and a full soul. He had realized the ultimate truth. Some empires are better off ended, and some kings are only truly free when they finally have nothing left to rule but their own hearts. The end.